Hi, and welcome to another episode of Prodigy Search Presents. I'm Mark Resch Jr., partner at Prodigy Search. Today, we're in for a real treat. Welcoming a longtime friend of mine and industry veteran, but new to the esports space, which we'll certainly get into. Good friend, Brett Diamond, Chief Operating Officer at Wise Ventures Esports and Minnesota Rokkr. Brett, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
As I said, Brett's someone I've known for many years now. Prior to him becoming a trusted and well-respected executive within the esports space, he's celebrating, I think, roughly your one-year anniversary, which we can talk to. I think it was right around the springtime or May or so of last year within esports after a 3-year run at the Vikings and I think nearly 12 years at the NFL league office. So we'll talk about that transition throughout the interview today and how he's made the leap over to this space. But Brett, let's jump right in. I mean, I'd love to talk about your current role within esports. People that aren't familiar maybe with the league, I mean, because there's some people that need to continue to be educated, as you know. But I'd love to understand what your role entails and also the name, because the name is something I think a lot of people want to hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. So as the COO, there's some of it is what you would expect of any COO role. Essentially, I lead the day-to-day operations of the organization from Minnesota. We're owned by the Wilf family, who owns the Minnesota Vikings. Our parent company, Wise Ventures Esports, is part of the Wise Ventures family, which is essentially the Wilf's investments in sports, entertainment, and technology space outside of the Vikings. So our ownership group is based in the New York, New Jersey area. I lead the operations from here in Minnesota. And you got your timeline pretty much right. It was almost exactly a year ago that I received a phone call while working at the Vikings, received a phone call from Jonathan Wilf, who essentially filled me in on what the family and their organization was thinking about in terms of their investments in the esports space, and then asked me if I was interested in coming on board as COO. And it's been a whirlwind year since that took place. And it's, I would say it's truly been the most unique year of my career, even before the current situation, which I'm sure we'll touch on, presented itself. But as far as my role, we're very much a startup, right? We announced the formation of the company on July 1st. And since then we've hired 18 people plus signed our first roster of players for our Call of Duty team. And as COO, my role, essentially, it's evolved a lot over the course of the last year. My joke is that whatever the next position we're going to hire, that's my job in any given
hire.
Yeah, exactly. So, I've sort of played every role from content guy to marketing guy to, quasi interim CFO. And sort of as we check each of those boxes off the list, from a hiring perspective, my role has evolved into what you would expect of a COO, which is to,
right,
lead the organization, but at a more strategic level. But certainly, I'm one that's always liked to get my hands dirty. So we're still very much in that mode to a certain extent.
And can't forget about. So tell me about the name. Let's talk about Rokkr for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. So Minnesota Rokkr is our Call of Duty League team, which is the first team that we established as part of the organization. So, excuse me. So the name Rokkr, and you can see this is our logo behind me. So it translates as twilight in Old Norse languages, and it has ties to the mythology around Ragnarok, which is the end of the world in Norse mythology. So that word actually spelled out is Ragnarokr, translates as twilight of the gods.
Okay.
So when we started looking at what we were going to name our team, at the time we were working with the Vikings creative team, which is an incredibly talented group of individuals. We've since spread our wings and now we have our own organization, our own creative team. But at the start, the Vikings team was working with us. And so we wanted to create a brand that had some ties to the Vikings, had ties to the themes around Norse mythology, but wasn't something, we wanted those ties to be subtle, right? It wasn't going to be Vikings esports. We didn't want something that was so outward that if you weren't a fan of the Vikings or you weren't an NFL fan, you wouldn't feel good about supporting this team. But we wanted a name that was unique, right? Getting into the esports space, we didn't want to have a name that could make sense as an NFL team or an NHL team or an NBA team. We wanted something that was unique, that made sense for us. And really our philosophy as we went down the list of names, we sort of said, if we could envision it as a high school mascot, we crossed it off the list.
Good.
Right. So eventually we settled initially on Ragnarok as the name. It was going to be the Minnesota Ragnarok. And then as we started going through the trademark process, most people are probably familiar with the Marvel Avengers series and those movies. And so Marvel and Disney had the rights to most of the trademarks around Ragnarok in sort of an entertainment and gaming space. And so that moved us away from that name. But we really liked Rokkr. We still like playing into that tie. So we knew it was going to require some explanation, but we thought it was a unique name that we could have some fun with. And our creative team has done an amazing job really building on those themes. I could spend this whole hour talking about just this name and some of the fun we're having with it, but I don't know if that's quite the way you want to spend the hour.
Well, good to your point, though. It's less of a mouthful of just it being called Rokkr for one, but I think you said this on other interviews too, and I've read this in other stories that you've been quoted on. The separation kind of church and state, right? I mean, people can associate because of the Wilf family and maybe the colors. I mean, right? You can, but to your point, the goal is for it to be two different things, right? And if it is subtle, then subtle's the most you want the connection to be. So I've liked that about the way your approach and everybody else's approach has been to the two organizations. So smart.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Mark. And really, that's from day one, our intention was to build this up as a separate organization for really a few different reasons. One, and probably most importantly, the Vikings have a lot of work to do running the Vikings. And we wanted to make sure that everybody that was associated with this organization, the Esports organization, had a laser focus on making this successful. And it really started there. In the early days, we used the Vikings creative team and really functioned with the relationship we had with them was very similar to what any team would have with an external agency. They were clocking hours, and we were writing briefs and exchanging, creative collaboration that way. I mean, obviously, there are people that we were very familiar with. And as we grew, we slowly separated to the point where now, I mentioned earlier, 18 full-time staff plus players. So we've really built our own team, our own organization. We still have, I would say, some hiring to do to get to, max bandwidth on where we want to be longer term. But we're at a point where we've stood this up as an entirely new organization. We've gotten through most of the key hires, particularly at the senior level. And really, we've hired some incredibly talented people, all of whom I believe could do the role that they have for any professional sports organization or really any major company. And that's probably truly the thing that I'm most proud of as I look back over the course of the past year and what we've accomplished are the quality of the people that we brought on board and hired to help build this organization with us.
Right, you talked about the Wilf family earlier, right? And I guess one of the things I'm curious about is, from what you were told, from what you understand, and certainly what now that you've been there for a year, but they were courting you and talking to you prior to that, and we'll get into kind of the career move that you made. But for the Wilf family in particular, and maybe the other investors, if you feel that necessary to kind of include them in this answer, what led to them investing in esports, right? And expanding their business interest into, to use your word, a startup, a relatively unknown space. I know a lot of other NFL owners, Jaguars owner has business interest in international soccer and in wrestling. And you have other NFL team owners that are invested in technologies or other venture capitalist kind of endeavors and startups. What about the Wilf family? Where did the esports idea come from? Why was that their play?
Yeah, great question, Mark. So the Wilf family and Wise Ventures as an organization had been looking into the esports space for a few years, well before my personal involvement. And it was one of those situations where they recognized it early on for the great growth potential that esports has, but wanted to take their time, evaluate the space, and pick the right moment to get involved. Mm-hmm. It wasn't important to them to be the first ones in, but still wanted to be in on the earlier side of the life cycle, which certainly it is. And they really felt like with Call of Duty League, it was the right time, the right opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
The esports space has evolved very quickly over the past few years, particularly with the franchise league model, where it's, and you can tell me how much, what level of detail we want to get into
Yeah.
here, but Overwatch League and League of Legends were the first two major esports titles to move to a franchise model. Overwatch League was the first to do the city-based model. Both of those have happened within the last few years. Call of Duty League was really the third to go to franchising. And when I say franchising, for those who aren't familiar, it's essentially building a model that's very similar to what you see with the big five sports leagues. Overwatch League, Call of Duty League are the two that are city-based. So we're the Minnesota Rokkr, the Chicago Huntsmen are another team. All the teams in our league are tied to cities the way a traditional sports league would be. Back to your question on, what the outlook was of the Wilf family and the ownership group, which also includes Gary Vaynerchuk, very well-known entrepreneur, very active in the social media space. I'm sure we'll talk about him as we go. But really, it was looking at the space had matured a bit. We'd seen the franchise model evolve, and the approach of the leagues had evolved in a way that got it to a point where we felt comfortable that this was the right time to get involved, particularly as it relates to Call of Duty. Call of Duty is the highest grossing video game franchise of the last 20 years. And if you look at the revenue that is just produced just on the sales of the video game itself, it's on par. It's not only the highest video game franchise, it's on par with Star Wars and the Marvel series and really any of the major entertainment properties. Call of Duty is right there in terms of revenue generated over its lifespan. And so what you're looking at is the potential for this league and this esports product to be the gateway for casual fans, for people that might be traditional sports fans, but haven't, and they might play video games, they might be interested, they might have a slight interest in esports, but we feel like this can be the title in the league that has that broad mass appeal to both traditional sports fans, from a culture aspect, that this can really be the one to send it into the stratosphere.
Brett, what about for you personally in that transition? Because you and I've talked about it as a search firm, right? For probably 8 or 9 years, we weren't doing anything too drastic and too different, and all of a sudden we've done about 5 or so esports searches over the years and recruiting for people in the esports space. And you and I were just talking as friends, probably 12, 14, 8, maybe 16 months ago. And, and we had, again, bare minimum amount of knowledge just based on a few searches we've done. But how's the transition going for you? Because, again, you've built up this long career in traditional stick and ball sports. You're a league guy. You were a team guy. You knew the traditional side. And it's something that was new, something that was unknown. I mean, listen, I don't know if you're a gamer, which I'm curious if you want to talk about that, or if there's any games you'd like to play, but how's that transition going for you in terms of moving from, how many games are in an NFL season, everything that you built up in the prior, 16, 18 years of your career, now unknown, completely unknown territory.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting. I can honestly say that the last year, and I'll exclude call it the last 2 months, when we've obviously been everybody's been dealing with this incredibly unique situation with COVID-19. So putting that aside, right, and we'll talk more about that. But up until that point, this had been the most fun that I've ever had in my career. And I would say that I always had on my professional bucket list working for an expansion team. The idea of building something from the ground up has always been something that was just so instinctively appealing to me. Now, I can't say that 5 years ago or 10 years ago I envisioned that being in esports, right? Yeah. But this experience of starting as employee number one and putting together the first org chart and spending all this time thinking about what we wanted to hire for each position, creating a logo and a brand out of nothing, right? There are times that I honestly pinch myself during our events when I see it on the screen or hear the broadcasters use the name, where it's just amazing to me that this did not exist a year ago, or even, publicly didn't exist 7 months ago. And you think about the meetings where this thing was created, this brand that is now Minnesota Rokkr. It's been an amazing experience. As it relates to esports more specifically, I would say that over the last few years prior to taking on this role, I had a professional fascination and curiosity about everything with esports as an emerging space. And I could have probably told you everything about the business structure of the existing leagues, again, prior to taking this job, but I couldn't have told you anything about League of Legends, the game, or Overwatch as a game, right? I knew how the leagues were structured because I would frankly nerd out on reading articles and reading about the business side of it. When I got to the Vikings in the fall of 2016, it was right as the NFL was launching a new initiative around EA Madden and their competitive gaming series and getting the NFL teams more involved. And I was already interested in the space. I had just come from the league office, and I knew some of the league guys that were involved in the project. And I'll tell a little story that I've never actually shared publicly, but it's sort of funny as a retrospect. I talked, and I guess I'll leave his name out to protect him. But I was talking to a good friend of mine that was switching roles within the league around the same time that I was taking on this role. And I knew that he was going to be more involved in EA and Madden. And I said to him, hey, if there's ever anything that you're looking for teams to collaborate on, let's talk about it. And he said, well, it just so happens that a week ago, we sent a memo to the very senior, to ownership and the C-level at the Vikings, which I was not at that level with the Vikings, so I wasn't on the memo. They said, hey, just a heads up, this memo's floating out there. We haven't heard back from the Vikings on who their point person's going to be. If you want to look into it on your end, go for it. So I sent a note to one of the Vikings executives and just said, hey, my moles at the league office told me this memo's out there. I worked on this stuff a little bit at the league, and I'm really interested in the space. If you're looking for someone to take this on here at the Vikings, I'd be happy to raise my hand for it. And they emailed back and said, all right, go for it. Here's the league conference call next week. And I thought of this story.
That's awesome.
I thought of this in another context a couple of weeks ago. And I honestly think that if I had not sent that, if I hadn't happened to ask this buddy of mine that question, and then sent this note to the senior folks at the Vikings and raised my hand to take what was at the time a relatively minor Vikings initiative and raised my hand for it, I would probably not be in the role that I am now. So certainly, for anybody on kind of the earlier stage of their career, and really like I was 12 years into my career when that story occurred, it's sort of a lesson to, if you're interested in something, don't hesitate to raise your hand and voice to whoever's above you in the org chart that you're interested in something, whether you're 12 years into your career or 2 months into your career. But to wrap up my answer for you, that's really what started me down this path of esports. I oversaw the Vikings esports related initiatives with the Madden series for several years, became essentially an informal advisor to the senior leadership team on anything esports related. And I sort of became the most knowledgeable person in the building on esports. I certainly wasn't an expert by any means, but relative to other people's understanding of the space, had at that point now produced a couple esports events for the Madden series, gave us a good kind of toe in the water of what that was, working with esports production companies, seeing how sponsors and brands were integrated from a sponsorship standpoint, working with the competitors and understanding some of the technical aspects at a rudimentary level, but understanding how those technical aspects influenced an event. And really all of those things built up over time. And then I was very fortunate that when the Wilf family was in the final stages of securing their first esports franchise, that they thought of me and asked me to take on this role.
Now, you, from a recreation standpoint, do you play, or over the course of your younger years, were you into video games at all? I mean, was this like, all right, I love the business side, I love the idea of starting something from scratch, but are you also a gamer? Or maybe you don't want to use that word, maybe you're not a gamer, but do you like to play?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not going to be putting myself on the roster anytime soon. But I played a lot of video games growing up. Certainly played my fair share and then some in high school and
Yeah.
college. After college, really didn't play a whole lot for several years, and once we had kids, it definitely went away. So I would say it was, I had put that part of me on a shelf. Once I took on this role, I had to play a lot of Call of Duty to learn the game, right?
Yeah.
So, I started playing a lot, really, to understand some of the nuances, at least get a baseline understanding of it. And probably, I will say there have been a couple of times where my wife has said to me, Brett, you're not on the team, right? You don't need to play that much. But I sort of look at it like getting into any new space, right? I spent my career working in the NFL. If I was to suddenly get a position in, I'll say, the NBA, because it's probably the big five sport that I followed the least from a fan perspective, I would have to spend a lot of time learning the nuances of that sport. And that's really not that different to how I view taking on this role.
Yeah. Brett, you mentioned, again, I joke, about burying the lead a little bit. We're a handful of minutes into the conversation, but a couple minutes ago, you mentioned COVID-19, and I'm curious about how the organization, let's just focus on the venture and work on Rokkr for this question, not necessarily, the Wilf family and the Vikings, the greater company, but how have you guys adjusted? How have you adapted given COVID-19? And again, I know you guys have worked out of an office before and clearly not, cut down on travel or no travel at all, but how has the organization adjusted and adapted from, again, specifically the esports side of things?
Yeah. So at a very functional level, our season was temporarily halted, live events, postponed and canceled like everybody else.
Yeah.
We're fortunate that the nature of esports allows us to continue the competition in an online format. So our league, Call of Duty League, has shifted to entirely online events. There have been 2 of those so far. We've participated in one of the 2. There's another one coming up this weekend, which I guess depending on when this post might be after the fact. But so we've been fortunate to be able to continue the competition in some form. We've also gotten involved in some charity events. Our players have played in several charity tournaments, specifically around the Warzone game mode of Call of Duty, which recently came out and has been hugely successful from a consumer and a fan standpoint. We hosted a Call of Duty Warzone tournament in early April that had some athletes and well-known streamers and influencers as part of it. Excuse me. And that tournament raised over $50,000 for COVID-19 related causes, which really was a great way for our staff to feel like we were doing some good in the situation. So from a functional and a business standpoint, we have our competitive matches. We've done charity tournaments and are continuing to look into more possibilities in that space. And then just in general have been continuing to work and produce content, and then also taking a step back and thinking about some strategy around next steps of the organization. I'll come back to that later on. But interestingly, I would say that as an organization, we're just as busy, if not more so, than we were before we had to shift to a work from home environment. Now, on obviously a human level, everybody is finding the right balance of, and I say everybody in our organization, every organization, everywhere, right? Everybody that's listening to this, everybody's finding the right balance between productivity and what you need to do from a business standpoint, what you need to accomplish as an organization, with making sure that the human aspects are taken into consideration. We joked around and talked a little bit before we started just on, office setups and those sorts of things. Like my desk is set up in the middle of my kids' playroom, right? Because that's where, for reasons that, I can or may not bore you with, it was the best place to set it up. But everyone is in a different situation. And that's what was important to us, was to recognize that everybody's situation is unique. I have 3 kids. Our head of marketing has 3 kids. So her and I are balancing things that are different from, a 25-year-old who lives by themselves but has, I certainly wouldn't say that our personal situation is easier than a 25-year-old that lives by themselves, but the dynamics are different and the stresses are different. And so for us, it was important to recognize everybody's situation is unique and have an open dialogue with our staff on how to manage the situation, right? And we said very early on, really before we were in, a quarantine circumstance, but we said early on to the staff, family comes first, health and safety come first. We don't want anyone to feel like they are ever put in a situation where they are asked to do something that they're not comfortable with, whether it's traveling. This was early on. We had our last live event in LA was right as things were, sort of starting to become more at the forefront of the public consciousness. So safety's first. I know you and I both know Frank Sapovitz very well, and when he was the head of the NFL events department, I was there. He had a saying that safety is a non-negotiable, and that's something that stuck with me throughout my career and was very much top of mind as we navigated the start of this situation, and we navigate it now. Right, where Minnesota recently relaxed some of the stay-at-home guidelines that relate to businesses. They've been, I would say, appropriately more conservative than some other states that are, quote unquote, opening up. I think Minnesota's taken an appropriate conservative approach, but has given businesses a little more flexibility if they meet certain guidelines. And so we're having those conversations about, do we have our online competitions? Do we have a limited number of staff in our headquarters facility? If we do that, what protocols do we need to put in place? What are the right things to do? We haven't made any determinations on those things, but we're spending a lot of time thinking about those things. We're spending a lot of time looking at, the guidelines that are coming out at the state level and anything communicated by the CDC. And I'm fortunate that my wife works for the Minnesota State Department of Health. So while I'm not getting like insider information, it's sort of easier to say to her, hey, what website do I go to get the official guidance from the state? So, very long-winded way of saying that we're spending a lot of time making sure that as we think about what comes next in the situation, that we're putting the safety of the players and employees first, while also looking at how can we be as productive as possible in a reasonable way.
You talked a lot about the internal, clearly the players, the staff, yourself, your colleagues, and that being paramount in terms of health and safety and well-being. And I guess on the other side of that, you mentioned the phrase work from home, right? So there's also that population that is working from home, or they've been laid off, or they're furloughed. And so you're finding in general, right, just screen time, virtual time, online time is increasing for everything, not just esports related, but people are clearly on their phones or their laptops or their other devices a lot. So have you guys had to do things to adjust to either increases in audience or better service, serving, people that normally would be in an office 9 to 5 and they're not clicking or they're not watching a match, they're not watching a conversation, anything on Twitch, maybe they're on Twitch during their work hours, I'm not sure, but how are you, navigating, okay, now we have a different population or more of an audience or a combination thereof online in any of your platforms, on your website, on your social, et cetera?
Yeah, great question, Mark. I would say we look at it in really 3 different ways. So the gaming industry as a whole has seen significant lift during this period. I mentioned Call of Duty Warzone, which is the new battle royale game mode that was released mid to late March, really right as a lot of people were starting to work from home. There have been over 50 million players in that game over the course of the last 6 weeks, and even that number is a couple weeks old, so it's probably higher by now. So industry-wide, gaming is certainly seeing some bigger numbers. For us as an esports team in a new league, in a new market, there's certainly an opportunity here for us to get, from an awareness standpoint, picture top of the funnel, getting to people that might be interested in engaging with this team. But in a normal media environment and sporting environment, it's hard to land on their radar if they're not already aware of it. Mm-hmm. So that's where we see an opportunity. There's just less, the reality is there's just less noise in the sports space. And certainly we all we all want and hope that we're back in a, in a live event environment as soon as possible. But while we're not, what we're thinking about is how can we take things that either we've done successfully as an organization or we had on the roadmap to do, and how do those things translate to a digital environment? Mm-hmm. So, for example, we had some what we considered significant success hosting watch parties around our official tournaments. So we had a couple hundred people that had come together at a bar in St. Paul to watch our tournaments in February and early March. And that frankly drastically exceeded our expectations. We weren't expecting, we thought we'd open the doors, have a handful of people that would come and, have a good time. And we had hundreds of people show up. So we said, okay, what drew those people in? What was successful about it? How do we bring that to life in an online environment? So we've hosted digital watch parties, or a digital watch party for our first online tournament. We've got another one this weekend that will do it again. We use Discord, which is a platform is very familiar for to people in the gaming space, but is also very easy to use. We had a player and a coach's that commented that their mom was able to figure it out, right? So it's not too complicated for people new to the space. But so there's a lot of functionality where it's sort of like you're bringing together a lot of different social media and chat functions into one. So there's a chat room typical to what you would normally see, but we've got staff and even myself and our other executives are in there interacting and talking with fans. And then in between matches, we would open up a voice channel where we would have our content director, who in and of herself is a very well-known influencer in the social or in the Call of Duty space, has an enormous, hundreds of thousands of social media followers herself. Ashley Glasso Midnight is her name. Her and a local esports caster, Doug Cortez, would go into this voice channel and provide commentary. We had giveaways, gave away merchandise and some other, headsets and other items related to the team. So basically, long-winded way of saying that we tried very hard to recreate what was successful about a live watch party and do that in the digital environment. And really it was just at the end of the day about the fans coming together, having a good time, interacting with each other, interacting with the team. And our philosophy has really been from day one, we need to build this fan base one fan at a time. As a new team in a market where esports is new, that's our outlook, and everything we've done really flows from that, whether it was in the previous environment or the situation we find ourselves in now.
You used the word noise, right? And you worked at a team prior in the league prior. So let's say, it's clearly some sports, NASCAR, MMA, those things are coming back the next week or two. Golf's going to follow. Other sports are on the horizon in theory, whether it's with fans or without fans, but your traditional stick and ball sports coming back. What does that do for the sport? You said noise, right? So now the noise is going to start to come back a little bit, but not like what it was, right? So you guys have started to build up again over the last 2 months, clearly, but you've still been able to serve populations over the last 2 months, and other sports have not been able to do that. So any fears of, okay, stick and ball sports coming back, we're going to lose X, Y, and Z, or what's your thought on losing when they come back?
Yeah. The way we look at it is there are some things that we do that we think will have a lasting impact once, call it business as usual returns, whether that is months from now or longer, right? Nobody knows. So we look at things and are just honest with ourselves about whether we think this is something that has a long-lasting impact, has the potential to have a long-lasting impact, but may or may not. And there are some things that we know will be sort of the moment, but if we can capture fans' attention and bring some number of fans along for the ride and get them interested in what we're doing, that's a big positive. So to give you an example, we have seen increased local media interest in what we're doing. We've had I would say a significant amount of media coverage of the team when we announced over the summer, when we revealed our brand in the fall, and then we hosted the first event of the Call of Duty League, Call of Duty League launch weekend in January. So we had a lot of media coverage around all of those things, but every step along the way, the media, especially local media, tends to cover esports as sort of more from the kind of the curiosity
Yeah.
of what it is, the business side and the culture side. And don't get me wrong, we will take all of that media coverage, right? It's all positive.
Right.
But a goal of ours has consistently been to get the local sports media to cover us the way they would a traditional sport. And I said to some of our staff way back in the fall that a measure of relevancy for us would be the first time that we had local media ripping us for not performing on the field, right? And that, somebody had sort of asked a question like, how are we going to deal with that? And I said, well, we'll deal with it, right? We'll have a plan. But I look forward to that. I look forward very much to that opportunity. So fast forward to this month, we did have the local Fox affiliate station who had covered us on a number of occasions, covered our charity events, covered us launch weekend as some of the other stations locally did. But they were the first station to say that they were interested in covering us as they would a traditional sports team. And that's really what we saw. They did a couple interviews before matches, after matches, took some B-roll, and really, like, if you just tuned into it, they were talking about, okay, here's how Minnesota Rokkr did. It's a tournament, so multiple games in a day. They beat this team, they lost to this team, and it was very much what you would see them cover a traditional sports team as, complete with the anchor making a comment about a lead that we blew, right? We ended up finishing second in that tournament, but we, along the way, blew a pretty significant lead in the early match, and we got ripped for it.
We've made it.
Exactly. But so that's an example of something that may or may not carry on, right? We're doing a lot of work to, we don't want to be too forward in anything that we're doing, but we want to make sure that local media, and others that we might work with know that we're still competing, know that we're still here, and then they can decide whether it's a story that's worth covering. In this case, the Fox station had proactively reached out to us, and we have a good relationship with them. We said, whatever you need, and we made sure that we were doing certain things to provide content to make it accessible for them. But it's an example of, do we know if they'll continue to cover us in that manner when all the traditional sports leagues are back? We hope so, but it wouldn't surprise me if it goes either way. But it's still a positive for us in what we're doing right now and building awareness of our team and our product among people that, like, I view it honestly as a positive if we're getting in front of people, that are 10 or 15 years older than me, and I'm 10 or 15 years older than a lot of our target audience, right? And so, things like local news coverage are positive. Maybe that endures, maybe it doesn't. But if we can get fans more aware of what we're doing, because there is less competition for their attention, and then we can deliver a good product to them, we're confident that we can get some of those fans to stick around, long term.
As a follow-up question, are there things, maybe the question is as much tied into the pandemic and COVID-19 as it is during normal times, right? Are there things that traditional sports and traditional stick and ball sports teams and leagues could take from the esports world and say, again, think about any startup, right? I think about the failed football leagues, but the NFL has adopted things from the AAF and from the XFL. So are there things that teams and leagues can take from, again, esports under normal, environment and normal, day in and day out, or what you guys have done during a pandemic, and apply to their? Do you think there's going to be any lessons learned or best practices that are going to say, I can't believe, okay, Rokkr did this, or this team or league did that. We're going to try to apply it to our traditional stick and ball sports. What do you think could happen as a result of lessons learned through the esports lens?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in sort of in perspective of the pandemic and what we're dealing with now briefly, and then I'll talk more generally about it and call it a non-pandemic situation. If I was with a traditional sports team now, and I imagine every we see the traditional sports leagues and teams thinking about how they can engage with an online audience. I thought the NFL did an amazing job producing the draft. I found myself thinking repeatedly watching it, about my colleagues at the NFL and all the work that they would have done to put on that production, and it was amazingly well done. I imagine every league in addition, forefront thinking about how they, how they return to play and how they do that in a safe manner and do it in the right way, is also thinking about, as any business would, what does the scenario look like? If a lot of experts think that essentially outbreaks will ebb and flow, right? You can return to, call it, a level of normalcy for a period of time, but if there's additional outbreaks in your area, you have to curb that. So I imagine every league, every team is going through that to some extent, and thinking about how you engage with a digital audience longer term, regardless of whether you're having live events. Esports was sort of ready-made to make that transition a little more seamlessly than others, but everyone's probably thinking about it. And I think you'll see that part of organizations' long-term planning going forward is, okay, what happens if, in a way that you didn't really think about it in a previous world. It just, everything's changed for everybody. Now, putting aside pandemic considerations for a moment, for me, if call it a year from now, 2 years from now, was to go back to traditional sports, some of the things that I think that world can learn from esports, a lot of it comes down to the power of one-to-one connections with the fan. And there are things that traditional sports leagues, I think, talk about a fair amount and do think about, but don't necessarily take it all the way. And there isn't the urgency to take it all the way. When you're in esports, or really when you're creating any team from scratch, I mentioned earlier, we have this philosophy of we're building the fan base one fan at a time. And that's truly the way we look at it. And it went back to, in the early days, we made a priority of responding to every post on social media, every DM, even when candidly I was the only employee. I would be responding to posts on social media from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. to make sure that these people got a response, because we were so young as a brand and as a team that my outlook was, if responding to this person makes them more dedicated and feel more a part of this team, and then they're more likely to tell their friends about it and more likely to be a fan and support the team, that was absolutely time well spent, to literally one fan at a time. And that's a philosophy that we've continued even as we've grown from one employee to 18, where to this day, we probably don't get 100%, but the goal is every comment that somebody makes about us in social media gets a response. Sometimes it's a thumbs up emoji or a smiley face or whatever. But everything gets a response. Every DM gets a response. And those are the sorts of things that we spend a lot of time thinking about as an organization, of how we build this fan base, literally one fan at a time. And I think that's something that every sports team, every organization can benefit from. It's obviously, the scale of it is different when you have, frankly, it was different 6 months ago than it is today for us. We had a meeting today thinking about how do we continue to scale this, because now we have, 40,000+ Twitter followers, and that number is literally growing day by day. So those interactions are more common.
Yeah.
So I got a little bit away from your original.
No, but I think you went down. But you answered it because where I thought you were going to go, because it's not just about, okay, lessons learned during the pandemic. I think there are other lessons from a normal, time of the year that regular traditional stick and ball sports can look at esports and say, why haven't we thought? But again, digital, but other things too. I mean, listen, the way you interact with fans and your consumers. That's a lot of that should be applied, and maybe will be applied in the near future.
Yeah, and I think from a business standpoint, esports is built on digital content first. We have live events. We have opportunities for brands to be part of our live events. At least we will once live events are happening again. But that's not it's digital content first for esports and live events second from a business and a revenue standpoint. Whereas traditional sports have typically been the reverse. Right now, we think that live events in terms of building a fan base are incredibly powerful. We have people that came to our first event in January that came out from a curiosity standpoint, and now are some of our very avid fans. So in terms of how we build this fan base, having live events and being able to do that when it's safe to do so is extremely important. But from a content business, how you engage with sponsors and brands and how you produce the events, it's very much a digital first mindset. And over time, that's the way the traditional sports industry is already trending in many ways.
Brett, if this goes well, I guess the last question on my side, if this continues to go well, right? You're talking about the growth and the success you're having. And again, I think you're modest in talking about it, but again, everything I've read, everything I've heard, you and the team have done a tremendous job. So the question, right, because this is our society and I'm part of that, which is, so what's next, right? Is the Wilf family, does Gary Vee, to the other investors, do you have other interests beyond Call of Duty and expanding into other opportunities, traditional gaming and esports, and others that are and others that are more NBA 2K. Again, you mentioned the FIFA or the Madden, right? I mean, but more in line with what you're doing right now. Do you think there's any growth or expansion on the horizon?
Yeah, absolutely. When we created this organization, it was with an eye towards the future. Minnesota Rokkr and the Call of Duty League team was the first step. We're on a regular basis evaluating future opportunities in the space, whether it's other teams in other titles, going further on the content side beyond Call of Duty. But we want to be very methodical about it. We want to make sure we grow at the right pace at the right time. We're incredibly proud of what we've built as an organization over the course of the past year. We've created what we feel is a team that, if you look at our league, you have a couple teams that are affiliated with iconic figures or brands in the esports space. So Atlanta FaZe is one. Obviously, FaZe Clan, iconic brand. The Chicago Huntsmen have probably the biggest fan base in the league, following Hector Rodriguez, who is an iconic figure in the Call of Duty space and truly one of the pioneers in esports. When we look at many metrics, and whether it's social media following, merchandise sales, just general vibe that we feel around the events, not a metric, but a know it when you see it thing. We feel like we're just a notch below those top brands in our league. And that's something that we feel very proud of, considering that this was a brand that didn't exist previously. In the final live event, which took place in LA in early March, as our team finished second in that event, and by the end of it, or partway through the championship match, there were fans in an opposing team's venue that were chanting for our team. And that was an amazing feeling.
Awesome.
And it's something that we've talked a lot about, being a brand that can appeal to a nationwide fan base, appeal to fans of esports that might not have a direct a direct loyalty to one of the existing teams that made the transition to our new league. And I think we're certainly a long way from saying that we've succeeded in that regard, but we're seeing a lot of progress as we've grown. So we do see we're looking for the opportunity to grow beyond Call of Duty, to grow into other titles. It's something that that we're actively looking at, and we are using this period to think strategically about what those next moves are. But at the same time, we want to make sure we grow at the right pace, in a smart way, make smart business decisions every step along the way.
Yeah. Let's get it right. Let's get this thing right before we move on to the next. So,
Exactly.
Listen, this has been tremendous. You and I, we've talked both at conferences. We've talked throughout, prior to joining and since joining the organization. I could listen to for a long time. I get educated. I hope others get educated on both esports, and then also particularly what your organization's doing, the growth and success you're having throughout the Midwest, not just in town there, but certainly the name and notoriety your team, your players are getting throughout the country and beyond that. So thank you so much for your time, Brett. I hope your family stay healthy. I know you're busy, so there's no downtime right now. Your work from home truly is working from home. So good luck and continued success. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me, and best to you and your family as well.
Thank you.